With the introduction of Rastakhan's Rumble, there were a few decks that entered the fray of the wild metagame, and started to shake up all the decks which had settled into Tier 1 and Tier 2. It does not seem that this expansion has a deck that has been created in the wild metagame that breaks the format, similarly to how Renolock or Star Aligner Druid did. Ultimately, the decks that have performed well over the past few expansions seem like they will be on top of the meta. This obviously means that decks like Odd Rogue, Even Shaman, Odd Paladin, and Big Priest will be back in full force once people have stopped testing post-expansion decks. This is the perfect time for one of the most flexible decks to come back into the scene and make good work of these decks, and that deck is Renolock. When we mentioned that Renolock is one of the most flexible in the game, we meant it, as the deck is much more diverse than any other deck in the history of the game. For those who were not around in Renolock's heyday and don't know much about the deck, Renolock is a deck which is centered around Reno and Kazakus, both of which consist of the Highlander effect, which requires you to run singletons in your deck in order to get their extraordinarily powerful card effects to activate. In theory, having to run singletons makes your overall deck weaker than other decks, due to only being able to use one copy of a strong card. However, and seeing as we are in the wild format and have access to every card in the game, there comes a point when there are so many good cards that the overall power level of the cards don't have as big of a drop-off between the best option and the second best. At a certain point, card effects hit a critical mass, and there are often cards that share a common utility, which can fill multiple card slots, rather than just considering it one card. For example, in the 5 mana slot, if you wanted to run a solid taunt, for the longest time the only option that you could run was Sludge Belcher. However, once the Witchwood came out, we received Rotten Apple Bomb, which in utility works as a duplicate in this card slot. While the actual cards are different, ultimately they provide the same purpose to the deck, and increased its consistency while maintaining the game-breaking singleton effects that Reno and Kazakus provide. With this effect in consideration, Renolock can fine-tune how it is built, and target specific decks without having to rely on situational tech cards as much as it did while in Standard. When looking at this deck, the arguably two most necessary cards are Reno and Kazakus, as they are the whole reason why you're running singletons. Reno's effect is one of the only ways that control can exist in the wild, as aggro is so fast that often your opponent is able to get you within a few life points from death on turn 6, sometimes even killing you on turn 5 if you aren't able to contest board early. The ability to heal to full at a moment's notice allows your plays to be a lot greedier, and allows for some turns which allow you to disregard your health total for board presence, knowing that you'll be able to heal to full later on after your opponent has mistakenly pushed his damaged face. Kazakus, on the other hand, has the ability to create a custom spell, which is one of the strongest effects in the game. We rated Kazakus in our number 2 spot behind the unnerfed Aviana Kun pair in our top wild cards of Boomsday video, as the ability is actually quite broken. With the flexibility of being able to take a potion at 1, 5, or 10 mana, you're able to make the potion work for any matchup you're having to deal with. In aggro matchups, you ultimately have the ability to get a board clear ASAP for going for 1 mana deal 2 AoE potion, or being a bit more patient if you have time by going for a 5 mana deal 4. If you're playing a mid-range matchup, you can focus on some of the other aspects of the 5 mana potion like card draw or the resurrect effects. And in control matchups, you can focus in on that 10 mana potion that nukes the board like Polyall or the 6 damage AoE along with board and hand refills. Secondary to these cards, but not by much, is the Warlock Death Knight Gul'dan. This card is worth putting into almost every Warlock deck, and our ability to play singletons really allows us to capitalize on the ability for Gul'dan to bring back a bunch of demons. He incentivizes playing big, strong demons such as Mal'Ganis, Voidlord, and Void Collar at a minimum, with most decks additionally running Dreadlord, and some running Abyssal Enforcer, even the Warlock weapon if they're super greedy. The next most important card that goes into a Renolock deck is N'Zoth. Again, running singletons allows for you to include really strong cards like Sylvanas, Sludge Belcher, and Deathlord, and you're already running Void Collar and Void Lord because of Gul'dan. N'Zoth is the first major card that you could consider cutting from your list. During Boomsday, a good amount of Renolock decks opted not to run N'Zoth, as Star Aligner Druid was keeping other control decks out of viability, and to compensate, the control winning card was cut for more anti-aggro, anti-combo tools. Bran and Zola are our next inclusions into the deck. These two cards provide more flexibility, as they allow for you to squeeze extra effects out of your cards. Kazakus is a great card to use with either of these in any control matchup, and against aggro, being able to get a Zola'd copy of Reno back into your hand is almost certainly game-winning. If you're looking for insane value, Baleful Banker can also fall into this type of card utilized, often comboing with N'Zoth to put an extra copy back in your deck with the help of an Emperor Thaurissan Tick. Speaking of Emperor Thaurissan, he's also a fairly normal inclusion in the deck, especially as the deck gets greedier. You'll often have a lot of high mana cost cards in your hand, and your discounts typically hit 6+ cards, so the effect is often worth the while. The next consideration when going into the deck is board clears and removal. Warlock has so many powerful removal effects like Defile, Hellfire, Demon Wrath, Godfrey, Twisting Nether, Siphon Soul, Blast Crystal Potion, Spellstone, Shadow Bolt, Dark Bomb, Spirit Bomb, Corrupting Mist, the list goes on and on. Often each deck will run 5 or 6 AoE clears and 2 to 4 direct removal spells, but again, based on the purpose of the deck, you may run more or less of either. Finally, we get to the bread and butter of the Reno decks, the tech cards. Even though they are called tech cards, realize that they all look to serve effects in the deck, and a specific minion's effect can act similar to others, such as Mistress of Mixtures and Zombie Chow, or Doomsayer and Plated Beetle, or Dirty Rat and Deathlord. Ultimately, these effects, while not identical, offer similar approaches to tackling the same macro game plan against opponents. Some of these tech cards are used more for their techie side, like Dirty Rat or Skulking Geist, and will often be more interchangeable in deck lists based on the meta that you're seeing based on how their effects interact with the field. Other tech cards are used more for their consistency, such as Gluttonous Ooze or Gnome Ferratu. Both of these cards have their own utility in certain specific matchups, and can be game winning similarly to the previous tech slots, but more often than not, these cards will be played for tempo. It's a 2 mana 2/3 and a 3 mana 3/3, typically fair tempo minions in a control deck. Now that we've gone over the basics for how to build a Renolock deck, let's look at some of the Rastakhan cards that have an impact when building this deck. Ultimately a control tool which has yet to have its limits tested, Mojo Master Zihi is a card which potentially has the ability to help its control deck in control mirrors. Oftentimes, in a value-based matchup, your opponent may hesitate to use their mass AoE removal when you only play middle-sized threats such as Sylvanas or a small Gul'dan board. Mojo Master offers 2 effects on this. As people are getting familiar with the Rastakhan set, his effect allows you to play a middle-sized board and then prohibit your opponent from using their expensive removal such as Twisting Nether to remove it and disrupt their mana curve, often snowballing the medium-sized board into a 2-turn lethal. Once this has become a common play pattern, he will offer yet another benefit. His presence alone will require for your opponent to use their board clears earlier than before, just as a threat that you could play him and snowball a game away. This allows you as a Renolock player to ultimately space out their threats more effectively than before and capitalize on the mind games that this card provides. Dragon Maw Scorcher is a card that will see play in Renolock in certain meta, especially if there's an influx of wild odd paladin decks, as it works as an additional board clear while creating a board presence to take care of future waves of minions. This 5-drop is just a solid card, and if the board-centric aggro deck was to get an uptick in play similar to how it is in Standard, would replace some of the 5-mana taunt minions which usually reside in the deck. The Undertaker is an interesting card in Wild. With N'Zoth and strong death rattle cards like Sylvanas, you'd think that he'd become an auto-include in Reno Warlock. However, this hasn't seemed to be the case once the expansion is dropped. Sure, he's seen some play, but one of the major negative effects that he has is it costs 8 mana, which is right around when your opponent is trying to kill you as an aggro player and unfortunately does not have taunt. This means that he's only good when you'll be facing down more mid-range or control decks, and when facing those matchups you need to modify your deck to remove Deathlord, which is a good anti-aggro tool, so you'll really be going in on a light aggro metagame read, or rebuild your deck to mitigate aggro more than a stock list of Renolock would. Shriek is just a good removal card, and is especially interesting in Renolock, as discarding the lowest cost card in your hand is much less punishing than a random card, as all of your top end in the deck are game-winning cards such as Gul'dan or N'Zoth. To be able to control what you discard is significant, and it could potentially be one of the board clears that you run in a Renolock deck. Jeklik is very similar to Ziliax in its utility. We believe that it supersedes the discard theme, and it's just a good as-is card for Renolock, as a 4-mana 3/4 taunt lifesteal minion is a good enough standalone card in Renolock, especially because you're always looking for good defensive options in the deck and you're running singletons. This leads us into the discard package, which can now be considered for Renolock. This expansion has brought a plethora of discard cards, but the one thing that used to keep Renolock away from using discard is the threat that discarding a game-winning card can provide. With Soul Warden entering the game, you can now afford to discard any card in your deck, as you have the ability to claim it back off of Soul Warden. This package has not been experimented with much in Renolock yet, but it has the budding presence of opportunity. Wouldn't be surprised to see some element of this package implemented in the top versions of Renolock at the end of this expansion once the meta has settled. Ultimately, while Renolock didn't receive any game-breaking cards this expansion, there were some tools added to the deck builder's tool chest. You're now able to build around different synergies and try out different card combinations, which are only now seeing viability based on new introductions from Rastakhan's Rumble. As always, please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and join the discussion in the comments below. Let us know what you'd like us to cover in our next Wild Deck feature. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to speed with all of Tempo Storm's Hearthstone news and content.